It was a Tuesday morning in late October when my son-in-law showed up at my front door with a locksmith. Not to fix something. Not because I'd called anyone. He showed up with a locksmith, a manila envelope, and a smile I hadn't seen on him before. The kind of smile that tells you a person has been waiting a long time to feel this powerful. I was still in my housecoat. I just poured my first coffee of the morning. The maple tree in my front yard had gone full red overnight, the way they do here in southwestern Ontario when the cold finally means it. I remember thinking as I opened the door and saw the two of them standing there that it was a beautiful morning to be ambushed. "Dad," he said, and I want you to notice that he called me Dad even then. "We need to talk about the house." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a document I'd never seen before. A transfer of title, my address, my property, signed, apparently, in my name. His name was on it as the new owner, his and my daughter's. I looked at the paper for a long moment. Then I looked at him. Then I looked past him at the locksmith, who was staring at his boots like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. I said, "Where did you get this?" He said, "It's all legal. You signed it." I said, "I didn't sign anything." He said, "The notary says otherwise." And then, I want you to picture this clearly, he gestured toward the street. My daughter was sitting in his truck across the road. She didn't get out. She didn't come to the door. She just sat there in the passenger seat watching. And when she saw me look at her, she raised her coffee cup, like a toast. 38 years I lived in that house. I bought it with my wife Eleanor in 1986. We raised 2 kids there. My daughter grew up in that house. She learned to ride a bike in that driveway. I coached her through geometry at that kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night. I drove her to the hospital from that house when she was 19 and had her appendix out. And she was scared and crying, and I held her hand in the waiting room until they told me she was fine. And she sat in that truck and raised her coffee cup. I need to back up, because this didn't come out of nowhere, even if it felt that way that Tuesday morning. My name is Theodore Marsh. Everyone calls me Ted. I'm 67 years old, retired 3 years ago after 31 years as a senior compliance officer at one of the larger credit unions in the province. My job for 3 decades was to read documents, to find the thing that didn't belong, to catch the error, the omission, the clause buried in paragraph 9 that would cost someone everything if they didn't see it first. I was good at my job. I was very good at my job. Eleanor passed in 2019, cancer. It was fast, 4 months from diagnosis to the end, and I won't go into detail because some things aren't meant to be dissected in front of strangers. What I'll say is that losing her rearranged me completely. She was the warmer half of us. She was the one who made the house feel like something other than walls and furniture. After she was gone, the kids worried. I understood that. I even appreciated it at first. My daughter Colette started calling more, coming over more. She and her husband, whose name is Reed, began showing up on weekends to help with things around the house. I thought it was grief doing what grief does, pulling families together. I thought it was love. Reed is the kind of man who is very good at seeming helpful. He fixes things without being asked and then mentions it 3 or 4 times over the following weeks. He offers opinions on your finances in the same casual tone people use to comment on the weather. He started coming over alone, sometimes just to check in, and in those conversations he'd work around to my retirement savings, my pension, the house, how much equity I had, whether I'd thought about simplifying. I noticed. I'm not a fool, but Colette was my daughter and I loved her, and I believed that whatever Reed was, she wouldn't let it go too far. I was wrong about that. About 8 months before the Tuesday with a locksmith, I had a knee replacement. Routine as these things go, but the recovery knocked me down harder than I expected. I was on pain medication for several weeks. I was not, to be honest, entirely myself during that time. I had trouble concentrating. I slept at odd hours. Reed and Colette were in and out of the house constantly, ostensibly to help, dropping off meals, driving me to physio, being, as I said, very good at seeming helpful. I don't know exactly when the document was signed. I don't know who the notary was or what story they were told. I don't know if my signature was forged outright or if something was put in front of me during a particularly foggy evening when I wasn't tracking well. What I know is that the signature on the transfer of title was close enough to mine that a layperson wouldn't question it, and I know that I did not knowingly sign anything. What Reed didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that 3 months before that Tuesday morning, I had spoken to a lawyer. Not because I suspected them specifically, but because I'd been reviewing my estate documents with my financial advisor, a careful woman named Brenda who has been managing my account since before Eleanor died, and she mentioned, almost in passing, that it was worth having a title search done on the property every few years just to make sure everything was in order. She'd seen problems before, clerical errors mostly, but worth checking. I had the title search done. What came back was not a clerical error. The transfer document had been registered 6 weeks earlier, quietly, through a notary in a town about 90 minutes east of here, far enough that nobody local would recognize my name or my face. The transfer was dated during my recovery period, during those weeks when I was on medication and sleeping in the afternoons. I sat with that information for a long time before I did anything. I'm not someone who moves fast when I'm angry. I've learned over 67 years that the decisions you make in the first hour of finding out something terrible are rarely the decisions you'd make after sleeping on it for a week. I called a lawyer. Not a general practice lawyer, a real estate fraud specialist, a woman in Hamilton named Patricia Osei, who came recommended by my old colleague at the credit union. I laid out everything I had. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I was finished, she said, "Do not contact your daughter or her husband about this. Do not let on that you know. Let me make some calls." That was 3 months before the Tuesday with the locksmith. In those 3 months, Patricia had done a great deal of work. She had contacted the Law Society of Ontario regarding the notary who had allegedly witnessed my signature. She had filed a complaint with the local land registry office and flagged the transfer as disputed. She had retained a forensic document examiner, a retired RCMP specialist who had reviewed the signature on the transfer document and prepared a written opinion. She had spoken to Brenda, my financial advisor, and gathered records showing that I had been on prescription pain medication during the period in question, medication that specifically warns against signing legal documents while under its influence. And she had done one more thing. She had been in contact, quietly and through the proper channels, with the Ontario Provincial Police's Financial Crimes Unit. I knew all of this that Tuesday morning. I knew it when I opened my door in my housecoat and saw Reed standing there with his locksmith and his manila envelope and his smile. I looked at the transfer document one more time. I looked at the locksmith. I looked at Reed. I said, "I'd like you to wait here for a moment." I went inside. I picked up my phone. I called Patricia. She answered on the second ring, because I had called her the night before and told her that Reed had contacted me demanding I vacate the property voluntarily, and that I suspected he'd be at the door in the morning. "They're here?" I said. "I know," she said. "2 officers from the OPP Financial Crimes Unit are going to be there within the hour. Don't let anyone change the locks. You are the legal owner of that property, and no one can compel you to leave. If he pushes, tell him you've retained legal counsel and any further communication should go through your lawyer." I went back to the door. Reed was still smiling, but it had gone a little tight around the edges. I said, "I've retained legal counsel. Any further communication regarding this matter should go through my lawyer." I handed him Patricia's card, "And I'd like the locksmith to leave. I have not authorized any work to be done on this property." The locksmith looked enormously relieved. He picked up his bag and was down the driveway in about 15 seconds. Reed stared at the card. "This doesn't change anything," he said. "The transfer is registered. It's legal." "That's a matter for the courts to determine," I said. I closed the door. I poured myself a second coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. Eleanor's kitchen table, the one she picked out at the shop in Guelph, back in 1994. The one with the small burn mark near the far left corner from the time Colette knocked over a candle at Christmas dinner when she was 16. I sat there and drank my coffee and waited. The OPP arrived 53 minutes later. What happened over the following 4 months I will try to summarize without getting lost in the procedural details, because the procedural details are tedious, and what matters is the shape of it. The notary who had witnessed the signature was located and interviewed. Under questioning, he admitted that he had not followed proper verification procedures, that he had relied on documentation that had been provided to him by a third party rather than verifying my identity directly. He had been paid for the services in cash. He was cooperative with investigators, which ultimately factored into his own situation. The forensic document examiner's opinion confirmed what Patricia had suspected. The signature on the transfer was not consistent with my natural signature. There were pressure patterns, letter formations that didn't match the dozens of authentic samples gathered from my bank records, my employment records, documents going back 20 years. Reed, it emerged, had done this before. Not with property, with financial accounts. An elderly uncle of his, years earlier in another province, had experienced unexplained withdrawals from a joint account that Reed had helped him set up. Nothing was ever proven in that case. This time, there was documentation. Colette, when contacted by investigators, initially maintained that she had believed everything was legal, that she had trusted Reed when he told her I had agreed to transfer the property as an early inheritance gift, that she hadn't wanted to bother me about it directly because I'd been unwell. I don't know how much of that is true. I have thought about it a great deal, at that kitchen table and in the evenings and in the middle of the night when sleep gets complicated. I don't think she forged anything herself. I don't think she knew about the notary, but I think she knew the arrangement wasn't right and she went along with it because she wanted the house and because Reed had a way of making things seem reasonable that they weren't. That's the part I still sit with. That's the part that cost me something. Reed was charged with fraud over $5,000, identity fraud, and uttering a forged document. The proceedings took time, the way these things do in Ontario. He eventually pleaded guilty to 2 of the 3 charges. He received a conditional sentence and 2 years of probation, community service hours, and was ordered to pay restitution. He cannot hold signing authority over another person's financial accounts or property for 5 years. The transfer of title was voided. My house is my house. Colette and I haven't spoken since. That's not a dramatic statement, and I don't make it with anger. I make it the way you describe a fact about the weather. After the investigation began, she called me twice. Both times I let it go to voicemail. Both messages were long and fragmented, and she cried in them, and said she was sorry, and said Reed had convinced her, and said she didn't know it would go this far. I listened to both messages several times. I haven't called back. Not yet. I don't know if I will. That's a door I haven't decided whether to open. My son and Martin, who lives out in British Columbia and who I probably should have mentioned earlier, drove out to stay with me for 2 weeks when everything became public. He sat at that kitchen table with me and we drank coffee and he didn't say much, and neither did I, but having him there was the thing that got me through that particular stretch of winter. He's a quieter person than his sister. He checks in every Sunday. That matters. Brenda, my financial advisor, has reviewed all of my accounts and assets and helped me make sure everything is properly documented and secured. Patricia helped me update my will, my power of attorney, everything that should have been updated after Eleanor died and that I'd let sit too long. My neighbor down the road, a retired firefighter named Gus, who has been bringing me firewood every autumn for 15 years, knows the story now and checks in more than he used to. None of these are dramatic gestures. They're just people being decent, which is the thing you find yourself noticing more once you've been reminded of what the opposite looks like. I think about that morning sometimes. The maple tree, my housecoat, the locksmith who couldn't look at me, Reed's smile before it went tight at the edges, Colette in the truck across the street with her coffee cup raised. I think about the fact that Reed walked up to the door of a house I'd owned for 38 years, a house where I'd raised his wife, a house that still had the paint on the baseboards in the upstairs hallway that Eleanor had chosen herself, and that I haven't changed because I don't want to. And he genuinely believed that I would crumble, that a 67-year-old man in a housecoat, handed a piece of paper at 7:30 in the morning, would simply fold. He didn't know that for 31 years, reading documents and finding the thing that didn't belong was how I fed my family. He didn't know that I'd already spent 3 months getting ready. He didn't know that the one question I asked when I went inside to wait a moment was not a question at all. It was a phone call to a lawyer who had already done her job. I don't feel triumphant about it. I want to be clear about that. There's no clean feeling at the end of something like this. There's just your house and your kitchen table and the burn mark on the corner from a candle your daughter knocked over at Christmas dinner when she was 16, when everything was still what it was supposed to be. I kept the card Patricia gave me. I send her a Christmas card every year now. And every October, when the maple tree goes red, I have my first coffee of the morning, and I stand at the front window for a few minutes, and I look at my driveway. It's mine. It was always mine. And the people who tried to take it have to live with what they did. That's enough. That's more than enough. I keep coming back to that coffee cup. The way she raised it, like a toast. That image has stayed with me longer than any of the legal proceedings. Longer than the court dates and the investigators' phone calls and the afternoon Patricia told me the transfer had been officially voided. Those things resolve themselves the way difficult things eventually do, with paperwork and time. But that image, my daughter, in a truck across the street from the house where she grew up, raising a coffee cup while her husband tried to take everything I built. That's the one that still sits with me at the kitchen table in the early mornings. I've thought a lot about what made it possible for Reed to do what he did, and honestly the answer is simpler than I wanted it to be. He looked at a 67-year-old man in a housecoat, and he saw someone who could be outmaneuvered. He made a calculation based on what he assumed I was: slow, trusting, too tired and too grief-worn to fight back. He mistook decency for weakness. He mistook patience for passivity. He didn't stop to ask himself what 31 years of reading documents for a living actually produces in a person. That's the thing about integrity. Not the word, not the concept, but the actual daily practice of it over decades. It builds something in you that isn't visible from the outside. It builds judgment. It builds the habit of reading carefully, of not signing what you haven't understood, of asking the question other people skip because they don't want to seem difficult. Reed saw none of that. He only saw what he wanted to see. And Brenda saw the title search anomaly because she was doing her job carefully, the way she always has. Patricia knew exactly which channels to contact because she'd spent years building that knowledge. The forensic examiner could read my signature's pressure patterns because he'd spent a career learning to look at what others gloss over. None of that happened by accident. It happened because people who take their work seriously, who keep their skills sharp even when no one is watching, have something to offer in exactly these moments. I had surrounded myself with people like that, and I was still alive to be grateful for it. What I find myself wanting to say, not as advice, just as what I've learned, is that the moments when it counts most are rarely the dramatic ones. The real work happens earlier. It's the habit of reading the document, of keeping your own records, of checking things that seem fine because fine isn't the same as verified, of not letting grief or illness or exhaustion convince you to hand your affairs to someone else without oversight. I didn't beat Reed in that kitchen. I beat him 3 months earlier when I picked up the phone and called a lawyer. Colette is her own story, one I haven't finished thinking through yet. I don't carry anger toward her the way you might expect. What I carry is something more like sorrow, and a question I can't quite answer. How do you let someone talk you into something like that? How do you sit in a truck across the street from your father's house and raise your coffee cup? I think the answer is that it happens gradually, one small compromise at a time, until you've drifted so far from your own sense of right that you can convince yourself it was always this way. That's not a comfort, but it is a kind of explanation. Martin drove out from British Columbia and sat with me for 2 weeks and said almost nothing, and that was exactly what I needed. Gus brought firewood. Brenda updated my files. Patricia sent a short email that just said, "It's done." Small acts, all of them. The kind that hold a life together. That's what I'm left with. Not triumph, not bitterness. Just the house and the table and the people who showed up quietly and did what needed doing. And the knowledge that living with care, real care, the boring daily kind, is the only thing that kept me standing when someone decided I shouldn't be.